Be Me, freelance writer specializing in gender analysis, wrote a piece last month about executive leadership that got cited in 3 academic papers. Feel like I've finally cracked the code on understanding how systems perpetuate themselves. The research is clear, the patterns are obvious, the conclusions write themselves. Men succeed because the game is rigged for them, not because they've figured out something I haven't. Been working on a long-form investigative piece about exclusive professional networks. The kind of access that determines who gets funding, who gets introduced to investors, who gets the real opportunities. My angle is simple and supported by data. These networks exclude women and then claim merit determines outcomes. Spent 3 months researching, sent out hundreds of interview requests. Most went unanswered, got a few polite deflections. One guy actually called me to explain I was asking the wrong questions, condescending prick, then got an unexpected email from Christopher, a venture capitalist I'd interviewed 2 years ago for a different piece. I'd been tough but fair in that article, didn't quote him out of context like I could have. He said he remembered me as someone who actually listens before drawing conclusions, which felt like backhanded praise. Offered me access to something called the Frontier Group. Described it as a quarterly gathering of investors, founders, and people building things. Said I could observe but not participate, take notes but not record, attend but not join. Made it clear this was a one-time offer and I'd be there as a guest, not a member. My first instinct was to be offended by the terms. But I needed primary sources. Needed to see these spaces from the inside. Agreed to his conditions while already planning how I'd frame this in the piece. The entitled gatekeeping, the artificial scarcity, the performance of exclusivity, showed up at an unmarked building in a financial district, dressed professionally, but not trying to blend in. Wasn't trying to infiltrate, wasn't pretending to be something I wasn't. I was there as an observer, and I carried that role deliberately. Christopher met me in the lobby, brought me upstairs to a space that looked like a converted loft. Maybe 60 men scattered around, ranging from mid-20s to late 60s. No suits, mostly casual clothes, none of the performative wealth signals I expected. He introduced me to a few people as a writer working on a project. Didn't specify what kind. Most nodded politely and immediately went back to their conversations. No hostility, but also no performance for my benefit. It was jarring to be so thoroughly unremarkable to them. Settled into a corner with my notebook, ready to document the toxic dynamics I knew I'd witness. Started writing down observations, looking for the patterns of dominance and exclusion. First thing that struck me was how much controlled chaos filled the room. Men talking over each other, but somehow still communicating. Interruptions that weren't power plays but enthusiasm. Watched one guy pitch an idea for solar panel efficiency to 3 others. They tore it apart immediately, found holes in his cost projections, questioned his supply chain assumptions, expected him to get defensive or shut down. Instead, he got more animated, started sketching on a whiteboard, adjusted his model in real time. One of the guys who'd been most critical suddenly offered a contact at a manufacturing company. Another pulled out his phone and sent an introduction email right there. The guy who'd been criticized thanked them and immediately moved to the next group. None of it looked like what I'd expected. No ego protection, no face saving, just rapid iteration and immediate resource sharing. Told myself this was probably staged for my benefit. Christopher had probably told everyone to be on their best behavior. Spent the next hour watching interactions that increasingly didn't fit my framework. Saw a 26-year-old kid explain blockchain architecture to a 60-year-old former CEO. The older man asked basic questions without any visible embarrassment about not knowing. Took notes on his phone, thanked the kid genuinely, introduced him to someone across the room, saw groups form and dissolve around problems. Someone would mention a challenge, and bodies would just drift over. They'd swarm the problem, throw solutions at it, argue about approaches, then scatter. No formal structure, no designated leader, just functional collaboration. Kept waiting for the dominance games, the status competition, the zero-sum thinking. Instead saw a weird abundance mentality I couldn't quite categorize. One founder mentioned he was hiring for a specific technical role. 3 different men immediately suggested candidates. One of those candidates was explicitly someone from another guy's company. He offered up his own employee without hesitation, said the opportunity was better for the person's growth. The founder doing the hiring thanked him and asked what he needed in return. The guy genuinely seemed confused by the question. This didn't match any model I'd built. During a break, Christopher asked how it was going. I gave him a non-committal answer, said it was interesting. He smiled like he knew exactly what I was thinking and walked away. The evening shifted to a different format. Someone dimmed the lights, and a man in his 50s stood up front. He talked for 20 minutes about a company he'd built and lost. Specific details about where he'd fucked up, what he'd missed, how he'd let ego drive decisions, described the moment he had to lay off 40 people because of his mistakes. His voice cracked twice, but he didn't stop. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Then someone asked a technical question about the decision-making process. Someone else asked about the emotional recovery. For an hour, they dissected this man's failure with surgical precision. But the tone wasn't cruel, wasn't mocking. They were extracting lessons, mining his pain for wisdom they could use. He answered every question with raw honesty. Admitted things I would never admit in a public setting. And they treated his vulnerability like valuable data. Wrote in my notebook, performing humility to maintain group cohesion. But even as I wrote it, I knew it wasn't quite right. Left that first evening deeply unsettled. My article suddenly had a structural problem. The evidence I'd gathered didn't support the narrative I'd planned. Told myself I needed more data points, different contexts. Spent the next 2 months gaining access to other spaces. Used the contacts from that first evening, even though it felt compromising. Visited a trading floor where 7 guys ran a small hedge fund. Expected Wolf of Wall Street aggression, instead found monastic focus. They barely spoke to each other during market hours, communicated in abbreviated phrases and hand signals. Moved like a single organism responding to information. During lunch, watched them review the morning's decisions. They criticized each other's calls without any cushioning language. No praise sandwiches, no softening, just direct assessment. That was stupid. You saw the momentum shift and ignored it. The guy being criticized nodded, asked for clarification, adjusted his model. No defensiveness, no hurt feelings, just immediate integration of feedback. One of them asked me what I thought of their process. I said it seemed harsh. He looked genuinely confused, said harsh would be letting him keep making that mistake. The care was in the directness, not despite it. My frameworks couldn't account for this. Visited a construction site where a crew was training apprentices. Expected hazing, expected exploitation of the younger guys. Instead saw a teaching culture that was rigorous and weirdly tender. Master electrician spent 40 minutes showing a 19-year-old how to read. Electrical load. Explained it 3 different ways until the kid got it. Never showed him patience, never made him feel stupid, but also never lowered the standard. When the kid made a mistake, correction was immediate and unambiguous. Watched another crew working on structural steel. The coordination required was insane. They moved around each other in tight spaces, handled dangerous equipment, communicated in shorthand. The trust was absolute because it had to be. One guy's competence was everyone's safety. During a break, asked one of the older workers about the culture. He said something that stuck with me. We're not nice to each other, we're good to each other. Spent weeks trying to figure out the difference. Gained access to a mentorship program in a law firm, specifically their litigation department. All male partners, all male associates, in this particular practice group. My initial observation notes were full of assumptions about gatekeeping, then sat in on a case preparation. 2-session. 6 lawyers tearing apart their own arguments, role-playing the opposing counsel, finding weaknesses, stress-testing logic. The associate who'd built the primary argument had to defend it against withering attack. They found a hole in his research. He admitted it immediately, no excuses. They rebuilt the argument together in real time. The senior partner made a point of crediting the associate's original framework, even while correcting its flaws. Watched them work until 2 a.m. The hierarchy was clear, but the collaboration was genuine. Junior associates challenged senior partners on legal theory. If you had a better argument, it didn't matter who you were. The status came from competence, and competence was ruthlessly evaluated. One associate asked me why I was really there. Told him about my project on professional networks and access. He said something that annoyed me. "You're studying the door, not what's in the room." Dismissed it immediately, but the comment lingered. Got access to a wilderness leadership course, one of those expensive programs for executives. Expected a corporate bonding exercise with manufactured challenges. 12 men, 1 guide, 8 days in backcountry. I was allowed to join as an observer, didn't participate in the exercises, watched them struggle with genuine physical challenges. Navigation, shelter building, food rationing, weather. The corporate hierarchies dissolved completely. The CEO who ran a billion-dollar company took orders from a middle manager who had actual wilderness skills. No ego about it, just recognition of relevant competence. Saw a guy have a complete breakdown on day 4. He sat down on the trail and started crying, said he couldn't do it, expected the group to leave him behind or mock him. Instead, they stopped, made camp early, sat with him, didn't coddle him, didn't tell him it was okay to quit. One guy said, "You can do this, you just don't believe it yet, we'll wait while you figure it out." They sat there for an hour while this man worked through whatever he was working through. Then he stood up, and they kept going. Nobody mentioned it again, but something had shifted. The man who'd broken down was integrated differently, trusted more deeply. The vulnerability had been a test he passed, not a weakness he'd shown. My categories kept failing. Spent an evening observing a poker game, high stakes, invitation only. These weren't professional gamblers, just wealthy men who played seriously. Expected toxic masculinity, expected risk-taking as dominance display, instead found rigorous probability analysis and emotional control. They respected each other's skill, studied each other's tells. The competition was real, but the community was stronger. One player lost $40,000 in 2 hours. He took it without visible emotion, complimented the hands that beat him. Nobody gloated, nobody performed. The winner bought drinks, and they analyzed interesting hands together. The loser contributed to the analysis of his own defeat, turning his loss into collective learning. Asked one of the players why they did this. He said, "Iron sharpens iron." Seemed like a cliché until I realized he meant it literally. They were each other's training partners, pushing each other to better play. The money was just the mechanism that enforced honesty. Visited a Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym, advanced class only. Spent 2 hours watching men choke each other unconscious. The intimacy was startling. Bodies intertwined, complete vulnerability, absolute trust. They'd fight until someone tapped, then immediately help each other up, explain what worked, show the detail that made the difference. Watched a black belt destroy a purple belt for 6 minutes. Completely technical domination. Then spent 15 minutes teaching him the exact techniques he'd just used against him. No holding back in the role, no holding back in the teaching. The purple belt thanked him with genuine gratitude. Saw newer students getting smashed by advanced students. Expected resentment, expected humiliation. Instead saw hunger to learn, excitement at seeing the gap they could close. The hierarchy was clear and nobody pretended otherwise. But the hierarchy was also permeable, based purely on skill. Everyone knew exactly where they stood and what they needed to improve. The feedback was delivered through physical domination. Couldn't be argued with. Couldn't be politicized, just reality. One of the instructors asked if I wanted to try. Politely declined, said I was just observing. He shrugged and said, "You can't understand it from outside." Wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Months into this research, my article was in shambles. Had hundreds of pages of notes that contradicted my thesis. Kept trying to find the exploitation, the toxicity, the fragility. Found competition, found hierarchy, found exclusion, but also found competence, growth, genuine brotherhood. The bonds these men formed were real, forged through shared struggle, tested by direct challenge. They didn't perform vulnerability, they practiced it functionally, admitted weakness in order to fix it, asked for help without shame because helping each other made everyone stronger. The communication style I'd always read as aggressive was actually efficient. Direct feedback was a gift, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt, because that's when it mattered most. They trusted each other enough to be harsh, cared about each other enough to be honest. The spaces excluded me, not because of arbitrary discrimination, but because they required something I didn't have and couldn't develop from outside. The shared experience, the tested competence, the proven ability to handle direct challenge without breaking. You couldn't think your way in, couldn't theorize your way to belonging. I had to earn it through demonstration. Attended one final frontier group meeting. 4 months after my first visit, I'd been to dozens of different male spaces. Walked in with my certainty shattered, my frameworks in pieces. Christopher found me during a break, asked how the project was going. Told him honestly, I had no idea how to write it anymore. He nodded like he'd expected this. Said, you came here believing you already understood, that you just needed evidence for your conclusions. Wanted to deny it but couldn't. He continued, the hardest thing is realizing there are rooms you'll never enter, not because someone's keeping you out, but because the price of admission is something you can't pay. Asked him what he meant. These spaces exist because men need them, not because we're excluding women, we're including each other. That's different. We test each other in ways that would be called toxic if you were watching, but they're not toxic to us, they're necessary. We communicate in ways that seem harsh because we trust each other to handle it. We compete because competition makes us better. We submit to hierarchy because we respect competence. And we do all of this away from evaluation by people who don't understand the purpose. Felt anger rising, started to argue. He held up a hand. You've spent months observing. You've seen men being genuine with each other. You've seen us thrive. And you still can't quite accept that maybe, just maybe, we know what we need better than you do. That's the gap you can't cross. Not because you're a woman, but because you're so invested in your framework that you can't let it go even when the evidence contradicts it. The words hit like physical blows. Walked out of that building in a daze. Sat in my car for an hour, staring at my notebooks. Months of observations that demolished my assumptions. I'd watched men supporting each other in ways I'd never acknowledged were possible. Seen them succeed not despite their masculine culture, but because of it. The directness, the competition, the hierarchy, the physical testing, all of it served purposes I'd dismissed as socialization or performance. But it wasn't performance, it was function. They'd built cultures optimized for growth, competence, genuine connection. And those cultures required exclusion to function. Not exclusion as discrimination, but exclusion as boundary maintenance. The spaces worked because everyone in them had paid the price of admission. Shared the assumptions, spoke the language, understood the rules. My presence changed the dynamic, made them self-conscious. Even when they tried to ignore me, they were performing for an audience. The real magic happened when I wasn't there. In the spaces I could never fully enter. Spent weeks trying to salvage the article. Wrote draft after draft, trying to fit my observations into some framework that preserved my worldview. Everything came out dishonest. I'd witnessed something real and couldn't explain it away. Finally wrote something true. Described what I'd seen without trying to explain it through my usual lens. Submitted it to my editor. She called me 2 days later, concerned. This doesn't sound like you. What happened to the critical analysis? Told her I'd done the analysis and it had complicated my conclusions. She suggested I refocus on the structural issues. Translate, ignore what you saw, write what you planned. Pulled the piece instead. Couldn't publish something I no longer believed. Couldn't defend my old positions after seeing what I'd seen. The humiliation wasn't public, it was private. Sitting alone with my notes, confronting the reality that I'd been wrong. Not wrong about everything, not wrong about structural barriers that exist, but wrong about understanding men, wrong about these spaces, wrong about my certainty. I'd spent years writing with authority about male behavior, male culture, male power, and I'd fundamentally misunderstood it. Missed the complexity, the functionality, the genuine value, saw only what fit my framework, and dismissed the rest. The men I'd observed weren't performing masculinity, they were living it. And it worked for them in ways I'd never acknowledged. They'd built spaces where they could be fully themselves. Challenged, tested, pushed, supported. Where weakness was temporary and fixable, not identity. Where hierarchy was earned and respected, not resented. Where competition made everyone better instead of creating winners and losers. I'd watched them thrive in environments that would have destroyed the cultures I valued. Direct feedback without emotional cushioning would have felt brutal to me. Physical competition as bonding would have seemed aggressive. Hierarchy based on competence would have felt invalidating. But to them, it was oxygen. The realization that cut deepest. They didn't need my approval, my understanding, my validation. These spaces existed and flourished completely independent of my ideology. My frameworks were irrelevant to their reality. I could write articles critiquing them, and they'd keep thriving. Because what they'd built actually worked, served their needs, developed their abilities, created genuine bonds, and I would never be part of it. Not because they hated women or feared femininity, but because the spaces required something I couldn't provide, couldn't be what they needed from each other. Sitting with my failed article, months of research leading nowhere I could use, had to confront the arrogance of assuming I understood. The entitlement of demanding access to spaces that weren't for me. The ideological rigidity that made me see everything through one lens. Christopher had been right, and I hated him for it. Hated him for the condescension, for the knowing smile, for being proven correct. But mostly hated that he'd given me exactly what I asked for. Access, observation, the truth of these spaces, and the truth had destroyed my certainty. I started over with my writing. Stopped pretending to understand what I'd only observed. Stopped claiming authority on experiences I hadn't lived. The humiliation was in the privacy of my own mind, knowing I'd spent years being wrong with confidence. That every article I'd written with such certainty was built on incomplete understanding, that the men I'd dismissed as fragile or toxic or threatened had actually built something functional and valuable that I couldn't touch. Never published the article. Couldn't figure out how to write honestly about what I'd seen without dismantling my own credibility. Couldn't defend my previous work while acknowledging what I now understood. So I sat with it, alone, with notebooks full of observations that contradicted everything I'd built my career on. Evidence that men might actually know what they need, that masculine culture might serve purposes I'd never considered, that exclusion might sometimes be about inclusion, not discrimination, that there are rooms I'll never enter, not because someone's keeping me out, but because the price of admission is something I can't pay, and that's not oppression, that's just reality. The final humiliation was accepting it, accepting that I'd been wrong, that my ideology had blinded me, that I'd approached these spaces with arrogance instead of curiosity, and that the men who'd let me observe had known exactly what would happen, known I'd see things I couldn't explain, known it would challenge me in ways I wasn't prepared for, and they'd let me in anyway, let me learn the hard way. Christopher sent me an email months later. Just a single line. Understanding isn't the same as agreeing, but it's a start. Didn't respond, but kept the email, kept the notebooks too. Evidence of the day my certainty died, and left me with something harder than arrogance. The humility of not knowing, the discomfort of witnessing something that worked differently than I believed possible. The isolation of being permanently outside spaces I'd seen from within. Changed how I wrote, what I claimed to understand. Became more careful, more humble, more willing to say I didn't know. Lost some readers who wanted the old certainty. Gained respect from unexpected places. Men who'd watched me from those spaces, who knew what I'd witnessed. They never said, "We told you so," just nodded when they saw my new work. Recognized someone who'd paid the price of real learning. Still a feminist, still committed to equality, but no longer convinced I understand everything. No longer certain that different means wrong. The men in those spaces taught me something I'd never expected. Not by explaining, but by letting me watch. By thriving in ways I'd said were impossible. By building bonds I'd called toxic. By succeeding through methods I'd dismissed. And by showing me, without words, that there are rooms I'll never enter, not because they hate me, but because they don't need me. And that truth, more than anything else, was the lesson I never wanted to learn, but couldn't unlearn once I'd seen it. The humiliation wasn't public, wasn't dramatic, just the quiet death of certainty and the uncomfortable birth of actual understanding, sitting alone with evidence that contradicted everything I'd believed. and no framework left to explain it away. Just the reality, witnessed and undeniable, that I'd been wrong, and they'd been right to exclude me, not from malice, but from necessity. Because some spaces need boundaries to function, and I was always meant to stay outside.